we hear a lot about both parties either wanting or claiming they're a big tent. Um, but let's be honest. Neither party is functioning like a big tent anymore. And in some ways, you sort of see it in this split that's taking place between Cuomo and Mondani. But the Republicans aren't really a big tent. Right now, the loudest voices, MAGA on the right, and arguably the activist progressive left, they're the ones dominating the conversation, and they dominate the perception of what the two parties are, particularly in the eyes of the opposition. And then that puts the squeeze on the so-called middle of the road voter, where they feel like they're picking between two outsized avatars of MAGA versus progressives rather than any nuance in the middle, right? This big tent, right? It doesn't really exist because these two bases of the party are defining right now the identity of the parties. And I don't know how much of that is the frankly digital perception, right? Is that the fact that our politics is so online, it's made it so binary that the mushy middle just doesn't have room to exist in the digital world, even though it exists in the real world. But you know, we can argue that point. But just take Lisa Murkowski. She's the Alaska senator who's an independent, gets elected as an independent these days, but caucuses with the Republicans. She admitted in a podcast that she doesn't feel at home these days in her Republican conference, but she doesn't want to have a label define her. And she talked about that. But it's a noble sentiment. But the fact of the matter is labels are what's winning now, right? It is very hard to exist if you don't have a label in our politics these days, because dissent isn't seen as independence. If Lisa Murkowski dissents, it's betrayal. Look at what look at what Donald Trump's doing to Thomas Massie right now, right? This whole Thomas Massie thing, you know, the fact of the matter is, if the Republican Party were a real big tent, they'd accept the premise that you're going to have your Thomas Massies and your Rand Pauls, your sort of super libertarians that are going to be a little cranky and ornery and not and really believe in a super small federal government and really believe in limited government on everything. And yeah, that's going to mean they vote no a lot. Right. And that's Trump's big complaint. But in many ways, he's trying to wipe out dissent in his own party by trying to make an example of people. You know, in Virginia, in the Virginia's first district in 2024, they got involved in a primary that was really more of a beef that Chris LaCivita and some Virginia Republicans had with the congressman there. But they put all this money and energy into defeating this congressman in the primary, and they barely, but they did it. And it feels like the same thing they're trying to do here. And the goal is to defeat him and to send a message. You know, it's almost like the horse head that they delivered in The Godfather, right? They want to send a message. Any other Republicans thinking about dissenting publicly? Any other Republicans want to criticize? So, you know, if it were really a big tent party, even though arguably 2024, the result made it look like the Republicans have become a big tent party. They're not, because it's a cult of personality party. And if you disagree with the king, you're out. And that's clearly how Trump wants to practice governance, right? He doesn't believe in coalition politics at all. He believes in a form of purge politics, if you will. So the problem is a real big tent, if you do it well, allows for disagreement. And yet our current media environment, our current political discourse just doesn't really reward disagreement inside each other's party, because there's this belief that if you disagree with the leadership or you disagree with the president, you're helping the other side, right? You're offering aid and comfort, right? What Thomas Massie's sin really was is that he agreed with Ro Khanna about the War Powers Act. And, you know, how dare you agree with a Democrat, right? Or if a Democrat does it, how dare you look like you're giving aid and comfort to MAGA? And it's an ugly moment we're in, right? Compromise is seen as weakness. Politicians who try to bridge divides, they become the ones most at risk. That's why our friend Don Bacon hasn't said whether he's running for re-election again, and it doesn't sound like he's going to do it. I got another person I want to catch up on. I'm going to give you a little political update of a few headlines that I want to make sure you haven't missed. About the only people that have figured out how to govern across these divides, none of them are in Congress these days. They're the governors, right? You have Republican governors like Spencer Cox, Brian Kemp. I think they've done a pretty good job trying to create sort of a bigger tent of their party. And on the Democratic side, Jared Polis of Colorado, Andy Beshear of Kentucky, Josh Shapiro. All three of them all seem to try to govern in that big tent philosophy. And look, in some ways, governors have it easier to do that. They kind of voters. I always say voters take their votes for governor sometimes a lot more seriously than they do Senate or the House, because I think they view their senator or their or House member as a jersey color to vote for. But I think they actually think the governor is actually representative of how they want to live their life, and they want to elect somebody that might help them live their life. So whether that is self-selecting and you get that kind of politician, or the job itself sort of forces that. But the reason why the whole potential second campaign here in New York City, where we might have a five-way multi-party race for the mayoralship, because I actually think the reason we have either party ever can claim to be a Big Ten is that the only time either party looks like they're a Big Ten is when they're offering shelter to those who feel alienated from the other party, right? So the Democratic Party looked like a Big Ten in 2018 and 2020 because they were giving shelter to sort of Republicans who weren't MAGA, right? Republicans who believed in small d democracy, Republicans who believed in the rule of law, thought character mattered in politics. So they offered them shelter. But those Republicans weren't necessarily, they weren't going to be offered a place at the table on policy issues. They weren't going to be offered a place at the table in that Democratic coalition. I don't feel like they didn't really get a cabinet post inside the Biden administration, right? He rewarded a few of these people with ambassadorships. Jeff Flake was an ambassador. Cindy McCain was an ambassador. But they really weren't involved in governing. It was sort of like, oh, no, we'll offer you shelter. You're a refugee from the other side. And similarly, in 2024, I mean, look at, go talk to a Venezuelan American who voted thinking that Donald Trump was going to he was going to deport bad people, but not my neighbors, not people like, not my relatives in South Florida. And yet you're hearing these stories as they took away temporary protected status for so many different groups, because I believe they simply want to up their deportation. They want to increase the pool of people they can legally deport. And with so many, we had a lot of Venezuelans in this country who were here and protected legally under a temporary protected status, they got rid of it. And you're hearing a lot of buyer's remorse in South Florida from many Venezuelans, particularly those that live in Doral, the actual neighborhood that Donald Trump owns a golf club in. And it gets to the reminder that, the coalition that elected Donald Trump in 2024 looked like it was a Big Tent Republican Party, but they're not governing as a Big Tent, right? I just told you the example of Massey, but even here, here they provided, again, just like the Democrats looked like a Big Ten in 18 and 20, but they were just providing shelter for people they didn't like MAGA. Well, the Trump movement was providing shelter from sort of refugee Democrats, if you will, who didn't like where the Democrats were going on culture, on some of these law and order issues, immigration and domestic law and order. But it's not as if those folks got a seat at the governing table with the Republicans, right? So I almost want to disabuse this notion that there really can be a successful Big Ten, at least not in the way our politics are currently developed. We'd be a lot healthier of political discourse if we had multiple parties. Right now, the Democratic Party is two parties in one. The Republican Party is two parties in one. This tent gets the fabric of this tent that they try to create gets stretched so much. There are these giant rips in the middle, right? Just on both of these, metaphorical rips. So, and I know some of you that have known me a long time have heard me on this rant before. But it will be interesting to watch what does a multi-party election look like, and we may get this in November in New York City, where it'll be interesting to see how they pitch voters. Now, since it will be winner take all in this case, it won't be a ranked choice voting system, which I don't think is a good idea. Like ultimately, the perfect multi-party situation, if we could get rid of the duopoly of the D's and the R's, allow for two other major parties to pop up. So we'd have sort of the four parties being sort of a progressive party, a nationalist party, that would be your far left and your far right. And then you'd have sort of a center left party that was sort of a business friendly, sort of mainstream liberal type of party versus maybe a more pro-business Chamber of Commerce type party on the right. But you have, and then, whoever were the nominees of the two leading vote getters meet in a runoff. I think it would create a better, I always say civilization invented politics so we could settle disputes without violence. It wasn't designed to be winner take all. The idea of politicking is to come to an agreement that keeps people from killing each other. It doesn't mean somebody gets 100% of what they want. Sometimes it's 70-30, sometimes it's 50-50, sometimes it's 30-70. But the point is what does it take to keep the peace? And if you have to make a compromise to get power, I believe you will more likely compromise into enact power. And right now, with our zero-sum game, you don't really have to compromise to get power. And if you don't have to do that, right, with non-competitive primaries or sort of, self-segregated districts, where you end up having hard, deep red or deep blue, whether it's state level races or district level races, it does sort of take that away, which is why you have such a mess. Why? I mean, Congress doesn't know how to legislate anymore because, there's a great story in Punch Bowl earlier this week about how the last thing, the big beautiful bill, that the last thing Senate Republicans want to do is go to a conference. Well, if any of you remember how a bill became a law, that used to be how a bill became a law. The Senate passed a bill, the House passed a bill, and then they got together in conference and hashed out the stuff that they disagreed on. Then they came back and voted on the compromise. But Senate Republicans don't even want to compromise with their fellow Republicans in the House. So we have so lost the plot on governing. Congress has so lost the plot, which is why you have these terrible sort of convoluted party line votes for these bills, whether it was Biden's bill, which of course, because it wasn't bipartisan, half of it's getting thrown out by the Republicans. And guess what, Republicans? Once you pass this big, beautiful bill, half of it will end up getting thrown out by the time the next party gets full control. The irony is if they would all think bigger picture here, had more patience, and actually watched Schoolhouse Rock and participated in Schoolhouse Rock, we might build some better legislation, but then that might not get as many clicks or as many likes.